The morning of June 4, 1942, erupted in flames as Admiral Koichi Nagamo watched his magnificent carrier fleet burn beneath the Pacific sun. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, lay dying in waters that would forever mark the beginning of Japan's naval decline. What had started as Operation Amie, Japan's ambitious plan to lure the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle at Midway Atoll, had become a catastrophic miscalculation that would echo through the corridors of Tokyo's naval headquarters like the tolling of a funeral bell. The architects of Japan's early Pacific dominance had built their strategy on speed, surprise, and the concentrated power of carrier aviation. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, understood better than most that Japan's window of opportunity in the Pacific was narrow. The industrial might of America, once fully awakened, would prove insurmountable. Yet as dawn broke over Midway, it became clear that this window was already closing faster than anyone in the Imperial Navy had dared imagine. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the aerial assault on Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, found himself aboard the burning Akagi, watching helplessly as American dive bombers transformed Japan's most formidable weapons into floating pyres. The same hangars that had launched the surprise attack on December 7, 1941, now served as tombs for hundreds of skilled pilots whose training could never be replaced. The irony was not lost on the veteran aviator as he prepared to abandon ship. The very success at Pearl Harbor had awakened a sleeping giant whose industrial capacity would soon overwhelm the rising sun. In the radio rooms of the surviving Japanese vessels, cryptographers worked frantically to decode the flood of American communications, unaware that their own naval codes had been broken months earlier. The victory at Midway was not merely a triumph of American courage and skill. It was the fruit of painstaking intelligence work conducted in the basement of the 14th Naval District Headquarters in Hawaii. There, a small team of codebreakers, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had penetrated the Japanese Navy's most secret communications, allowing Admiral Chester Nimitz to position his forces with deadly precision. As the sun set on that fateful day, painting the oil-slicked waters in shades of crimson and gold, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably. The Japanese combined fleet, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months with seemingly unstoppable force, now faced a harsh reality. America's industrial machine was just beginning to demonstrate its true potential. In shipyards from Newport News to Bremerton, keels were being laid for carriers that would dwarf anything in the Japanese fleet, while aircraft factories in California and Connecticut prepared to unleash a torrent of fighters and bombers that would darken Pacific skies. The collapse that began at Midway would prove to be more than a single tactical defeat. It marked the beginning of a systematic dismantling of Japanese naval power that would unfold over the next 3 years with the inexorable force of a Pacific typhoon, leaving the once mighty Imperial Navy broken and scattered across the ocean floor. The aftermath of Midway reverberated through the Imperial Japanese Navy like seismic shocks, fundamentally altering the strategic landscape of the Pacific War. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Japan's early victories, found himself confronting a sobering reality aboard his flagship Yamato in Truk Lagoon. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their irreplaceable air groups had not merely weakened Japanese naval aviation, it had shattered the carefully constructed timetable upon which Japan's entire Pacific strategy depended. In the humid briefing rooms of combined fleet headquarters, staff officers pored over damage reports that painted an increasingly grim picture. The carrier Shokaku, damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May, remained under repair. Zuikaku, though undamaged, had lost most of her experienced aircrew and required months to rebuild her air group. Of the 6 large carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, only Zuikaku remained operational. a stark testament to how quickly the tide of war could turn. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American shipyards hummed with unprecedented activity. The Essex-class carriers, each displacing 27,000 tons and capable of operating 90 aircraft, began sliding down shipways with mechanical regularity. The USS Essex herself, commissioned in December 1942, followed by Yorktown in April 1943, then Intrepid, Hornet, and Franklin in rapid succession. Each new carrier represented not just increased American naval strength, but a quantum leap in aviation technology and tactical doctrine that would leave Japanese defenders scrambling to adapt. The transformation extended beyond mere numbers. American naval aviation had learned harsh lessons from the early months of the war, when obsolescent Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats struggled against the superior Mitsubishi Zero. By mid-1943, squadrons were transitioning to the Grumman Hellcat, a rugged fighter designed specifically to counter Japanese advantages in maneuverability and range. Simultaneously, the Douglas Dauntless dive bomber and Grumman Avenger torpedo bomber provided striking power that would prove devastatingly effective against Japanese surface vessels. Japanese naval commanders, accustomed to the tactical flexibility that had characterized their early victories, now found themselves increasingly constrained by fuel shortages and the need to husband their remaining experienced pilots. The loss of seasoned aircrew at Midway could not be quickly remedied. Japanese pilot training programs, originally designed for quality over quantity, proved inadequate to replace losses on the scale now required. Each engagement consumed precious human resources that took months or years to replace, while American training schools graduated thousands of new aviators monthly. Admiral William Halsey, whose aggressive leadership style had earned him the nickname Bull, recognized the shifting dynamic and pressed for immediate offensive action. His South Pacific forces, rebuilt after the losses at Guadalcanal, began probing Japanese defensive positions throughout the Solomon Islands. Each probe revealed growing weaknesses in Japanese air defenses, as overstretched squadrons struggled to maintain coverage across an increasingly broad front. The strategic initiative, so decisively seized by Japan in December 1941, had passed irrevocably to American hands. What followed would be not a series of desperate defensive actions, but a carefully orchestrated campaign of island hopping that would systematically dismantle Japan's Pacific Empire while American naval forces grew stronger with each passing month. By the spring of 1943, the American naval construction program had achieved a momentum that defied Japanese comprehension. In the sprawling shipyards of Norfolk, Newport News, and Brooklyn, the sound of riveting guns and welding torches created a metallic symphony that spoke of national determination transformed into industrial reality. The Two-Ocean Navy Act, passed by Congress in July 1940, had authorized the construction of vessels totaling 4.8 million tons, a figure that would have seemed fantastical to pre-war naval planners, but now represented merely the foundation of American maritime supremacy. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, stood before massive wall charts in his Pentagon office, watching as colored pins marked the commission dates of new vessels. The statistics told a story of industrial mobilization unprecedented in human history. By war's end, American shipyards would launch 151 aircraft carriers of all types, 877 destroyers, and 203 submarines. Each vessel represented not merely steel and machinery, but the concentrated effort of millions of workers whose shifts began before dawn and ended long after sunset. The Japanese naval staff, working from their headquarters in the former Navy Ministry building in Tokyo, faced the impossible task of countering this industrial avalanche with resources that dwindled monthly. Fuel oil, once abundant from conquered territories in the Dutch East Indies, now arrived sporadically as American submarines took an increasingly heavy toll on tanker traffic. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who assumed command of the combined fleet following Yamamoto's death in April 1943, inherited a force that possessed neither the fuel to train properly nor the aircraft to replace combat losses. This context is taken from U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings, The Pacific War's Industrial Foundation, 1975. The contrast became starkest in pilot training, where American and Japanese approaches diverged dramatically. At Pensacola, Corpus Christi, and Jacksonville, American naval aviation schools processed thousands of student pilots through comprehensive programs that emphasized both individual skill and tactical coordination. Advanced training included realistic combat scenarios, extensive gunnery practice, and formation flying that prepared aviators for the complex multi-carrier operations that would characterize later Pacific campaigns. Japanese training, constrained by fuel shortages and the pressing need to rush replacements to frontline units, increasingly relied on abbreviated programs that emphasized individual courage over technical proficiency. Flight schools that had once required years to produce a carrier-qualified pilot now graduated aviators after months of instruction, many of whom possessed insufficient experience in night flying, formation tactics, or carrier operations. The result was predictable. As American naval aviation grew more sophisticated and numerous, Japanese air groups became progressively less effective, their ranks filled with brave but inadequately trained young men who fell victim to increasingly experienced American pilots. The technological gap widened simultaneously. American aircraft manufacturers, operating under cost-plus contracts that prioritize performance over economy, introduced innovations at a pace that left Japanese designers struggling to respond. Radar-equipped night fighters, aircraft with self-sealing fuel tanks and armor protection, and new generations of more powerful engines gave American naval aviation advantages that compounded with each engagement. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, embodied this new American naval confidence as he planned operations that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. His fast carrier task forces, built around the new Essex-class carriers and supported by fast battleships and cruisers, possessed the striking power and endurance to maintain sustained operations deep in Japanese-controlled waters, a capability that would soon transform the strategic balance throughout the Pacific. The summer of 1944 witnessed the full flowering of American naval power as Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet assembled for Operation Forager, the assault on the Mariana Islands. 15 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers formed the largest naval armada in Pacific War history to that point, their combined firepower representing the industrial might of a fully mobilized America. As these ships gathered in Marshall Islands anchorages, their very presence announced that the era of Japanese defensive perimeters had ended. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese mobile fleet from his flagship Taiho, understood that the coming battle would determine whether the Imperial Navy could continue to exist as an effective fighting force. His force of 9 carriers, 5 battleships, and supporting vessels represented virtually everything Japan could still deploy, gathered from bases as distant as Singapore and Kure. Yet even this concentration of remaining strength paled before the American Armada approaching Saipan, Guam, and Tinian. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, which commenced on June 19, 1944, demonstrated the complete transformation of naval aviation since Midway. American fighter pilots, flying the superb Grumman Hellcat, possessed training, equipment, and numerical advantages that turned what the Japanese intended as a decisive battle into what American aviators dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a single day, Japanese naval aviation lost 450 aircraft and their irreplaceable crews, while American losses totaled 29 planes. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, flying from the USS Essex exemplified the new generation of American naval aviators who had trained under wartime conditions that emphasized teamwork, communication, and superior tactics. On October 24, 1944, McCampbell would shoot down 9 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement, demonstrating the profound skill gap that had developed between American and Japanese pilots. His achievement was remarkable, not merely for its individual brilliance, but because it represented the systematic superiority that American naval aviation had achieved through superior training, equipment, and operational doctrine. The Japanese response revealed the desperation that now characterized their naval strategy. Admiral Ozawa's carriers, stripped of experienced pilots, increasingly functioned as mere aircraft transports, ferrying planes to land bases where they could be maintained by ground crews, rather than the specialized carrier personnel who had once made Japanese naval aviation formidable. The carriers themselves, including the massive Taiho and Shokaku, fell victim to submarine attacks that exploited the very predictability forced upon Japanese operations by their weakened state. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58, operating with the confidence born of overwhelming superiority, launched long-range strikes that pushed the boundaries of carrier aviation. On June 20th, American dive bombers and torpedo planes flew 260 miles to attack the retreating Japanese fleet, accepting the risk of night landings on carrier decks in order to complete the destruction of Ozawa's force. The successful recovery of most aircraft demonstrated not only pilot skill but the sophisticated air traffic control and landing systems that American carriers had developed. The simultaneous ground campaigns on Saipan, Guam, and Tinian proceeded with methodical efficiency that reflected American mastery of amphibious warfare. Each island featured harbors and airfields that would support further advances toward Japan itself, while their capture severed crucial supply lines between Japan and its remaining Pacific garrisons. The new Boeing B-29 superfortresses, operating from bases on Saipan and Tinian, would soon bring the war directly to Japanese cities, completing the strategic encirclement that American naval power had made possible. The autumn of 1944 found Japanese naval commanders confronting a strategic nightmare that had been months in the making. Admiral Toyota, reviewing intelligence reports in his Tokyo headquarters, faced the stark reality that American naval forces now possessed the capability to strike virtually anywhere in the Western Pacific, while Japanese defenders could respond only with increasingly desperate measures. The combined fleet, once the most powerful naval force in the Pacific, had been reduced to a shadow force dependent upon land-based aviation and suicide tactics to achieve any meaningful results. The Philippine Sea victory had cost Japan not merely ships and aircraft, but the trained personnel essential to naval aviation operations. Carrier flight deck crews, maintenance specialists, and navigation officers, the technical backbone of naval aviation, had been lost in numbers that could not be replaced within the shortened timeframe that Japan's strategic position now demanded. American submarines, operating with near impunity throughout Japanese shipping lanes, had sunk the training ships and tankers necessary to prepare replacement crews, creating a cascading series of shortages that affected every aspect of naval operations. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding Pacific Ocean areas from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, possessed intelligence capabilities that gave American forces unprecedented advantages in operational planning. The breaking of Japanese naval codes, combined with aerial reconnaissance and submarine patrols, provided detailed information about Japanese fleet movements, supply schedules, and defensive preparations. This intelligence picture enabled American commanders to concentrate overwhelming force at decisive points while avoiding heavily defended areas that would produce needless casualties. The October 1944 Battle of Leyte Gulf represented the final spasm of the Imperial Japanese Navy as an offensive force. Admiral Takeo Kurita's Center Force built around the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, attempted to break through American naval defenses and destroy the invasion fleet supporting General Douglas MacArthur's return to the Philippines. The plan required precise coordination between widely separated Japanese forces, complicated by communication problems and fuel shortages that had plagued Japanese operations throughout the year. The engagement that followed demonstrated how completely American naval doctrine had evolved since the early war years. Rear Admiral Thomas Sprague's escort carriers, originally designed for convoy protection and amphibious support, found themselves facing battleships and heavy cruisers in a running gun battle off Samar Island. The destroyers USS Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts, vastly outgunned by Japanese heavy units, pressed home torpedo attacks with such determination that Kurita's force withdrew despite achieving tactical surprise, the destruction of the Japanese Southern force under Admiral Shoshi Nishimura illustrated American mastery of night surface combat, a skill that had been painfully acquired during the savage fighting around Guadalcanal 2 years earlier. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's battle line, comprising 6 battleships and 8 cruisers, executed a perfect crossing of the T that annihilated Nishimura's force in Surigao Strait. 5 of the 7 Japanese ships were sunk, including the battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, while American losses totaled 1 PT boat. The simultaneous destruction of Admiral Ozawa's carrier force off Cape Engano completed the dismantling of Japanese naval aviation. The 4 carriers Zuikaku, Kitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho, operating with skeleton air groups that reflected Japan's pilot shortage, served primarily as decoys to draw American attention from the surface action off Samar. Their sacrifice achieved tactical success, but at a strategic cost that Japan could not afford. The last experienced carrier aircrews and the final operational carriers of the once mighty Kido Butai, Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet, pursuing Ozawa's carriers with overwhelming force, demonstrated the operational flexibility that American naval power had achieved through 2 years of hard-fought experience and industrial expansion that continued to accelerate even as the war entered its final phase. The opening months of 1945 witnessed American naval power reaching its ultimate expression as the fast carrier task forces of the 3rd and 5th Fleets operated with complete impunity throughout Japanese home waters. Admiral Halsey's Task Force 38, comprising 16 aircraft carriers, 8 battleships, and dozens of supporting vessels, routinely launched airstrikes against targets that had been considered invulnerable just months earlier. The industrial heart of Japan, from the Kure Naval Arsenal to the Yokosuka Navy Yard, lay exposed to American carrier aviation that operated with professional efficiency, honed through 3 years of continuous combat. The once formidable combined fleet had been reduced to scattered remnants hiding in harbors that offered protection from air attack but prevented any meaningful offensive operations. The super battleship Yamato, designed to be the ultimate expression of naval power, sat immobile at Kure due to fuel shortages that made training impossible and combat operations prohibitively expensive. Her sister ship Musashi rested on the bottom of the Sibian Sea, victim of concentrated air attacks during the Battle of Leyte Gulf that had demonstrated the obsolescence of battleship-centered naval strategy. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, now commanding Task Force 58 as part of Admiral Spruance's 5th Fleet, planned and executed operations of unprecedented scope and complexity. The February 19, 1945 raids on the Tokyo area involved over 1,000 American aircraft striking simultaneously at airfields, aircraft factories, and naval installations. Japanese fighter opposition, once formidable enough to exact heavy casualties from attacking formations, had been reduced to desperate attacks by inexperienced pilots flying obsolescent aircraft with insufficient fuel for adequate training. Transformation of American naval aviation had proceeded beyond mere numerical superiority to achieve qualitative advantages that compounded with each engagement. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, already dominant over Japanese fighters, was being supplemented by the Vought 4U Corsair, a gull-winged fighter whose performance exceeded that of any Japanese aircraft in service. Similarly, the Douglas SB-2C Helldiver and Grumman TB-F Avenger provided striking power that could penetrate the most heavily defended targets with acceptable losses. Japanese naval strategy, once characterized by bold offensive operations and flexible tactical doctrine, had degenerated into desperate expedients that reflected the hopelessness of their strategic position. The Khitan suicide submarines and Oka rocket-powered bombs represented technological sophistication, applied to tactics of desperation, weapons that could inflict damage but could not alter the fundamental balance of forces that now favored America by overwhelming margins. The April 7, 1945, sortie of the Yamato and her escorts represented the final offensive operation of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Admiral Sakichi Ito, commanding this pathetic remnant from the light cruiser Yahagi, understood that his force possessed insufficient fuel for a return voyage and inadequate air cover to survive contact with American carrier aviation. The mission, designated Operation Tengo, called for a one-way voyage to Okinawa, where the ships would beach themselves and fight as stationary gun batteries until destroyed. The engagement that followed demonstrated the complete maturation of American naval aviation. Task Force 58 aircraft, guided by radar and coordinated through sophisticated communication systems, overwhelmed Japanese anti-aircraft defenses through concentrated attacks that exploited every weakness in ship design and tactical deployment. The Yamato, struck by multiple torpedoes and bombs, capsized and exploded with the loss of nearly her entire crew, taking with her the last vestiges of Japanese naval power and the tactical doctrines that had once dominated the Pacific. The final months of the Pacific War witnessed the complete collapse of Japanese naval power as an organized force, leaving the once mighty Imperial Navy scattered across the ocean floor or trapped in harbors by fuel shortages and overwhelming American air superiority. Admiral Toyota, commanding from his bunker headquarters in Tokyo, possessed on paper a fleet that included several battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, but these vessels had been rendered impotent by the systematic destruction of Japan's maritime infrastructure and the trained personnel necessary for naval operations. The strategic bombing campaign launched from the Mariana Islands had targeted not merely Japanese cities, but the industrial base that supported naval construction and maintenance. The Mitsubishi Heavy Industries facilities at Nagasaki, the Kawasaki shipyards at Kobe, and the naval arsenals at Kure and Sasebo lay in ruins, their specialized machinery destroyed and their skilled workers either killed or dispersed. Without these facilities, the remaining ships of the combined fleet could not be maintained, much less modernized to meet the technological challenges posed by American naval aviation. American submarine warfare had achieved a completeness of victory that surpassed even the most optimistic pre-war projections. The USS Wohoo, Harder, Tang, and dozens of other submarines had systematically destroyed Japanese merchant shipping, reducing imports to Japan proper by over 90% compared to pre-war levels. The tankers necessary to fuel naval operations, the cargo ships required to transport raw materials, and the specialized vessels needed to support overseas garrisons had been sent to the bottom in numbers that made economic recovery impossible within any reasonable time frame. The human cost of Japan's naval collapse extended far beyond battle casualties to encompass the systematic destruction of institutional knowledge and operational expertise that had taken decades to accumulate. The senior officers who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, the veteran pilots who had dominated early Pacific air battles, and the experienced seamen who had operated complex naval machinery. All lay dead or had been withdrawn from active service due to exhaustion and battle fatigue. Their replacements, hastily trained and inadequately equipped, could not maintain the standards of professional competence that effective naval operations required. Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement on August 15, 1945, formally acknowledged what had been apparent for months. Japanese naval power had been so thoroughly destroyed that continued resistance was impossible. The Imperial Navy that had once projected Japanese power across the Pacific from the Aleutians to Australia now consisted primarily of training ships and obsolescent vessels suitable only for coastal patrol duties. The aircraft carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were gone, their flight decks now serving as homes for fish, rather than platforms for the projection of naval aviation. Admiral Nimitz, accepting the Japanese surrender aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, could survey the assembled ships of the Pacific Fleet with justifiable pride. The force that had begun the war with 3 operational aircraft carriers had grown to encompass over 100 carriers of all types, supported by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines that represented the most powerful naval force in human history. The industrial base that had produced this armada continued to operate at full capacity, capable of maintaining American naval supremacy for generations to come. The collapse of Japanese naval command represented more than military defeat. It marked the end of a strategic vision that had sought to create a maritime empire spanning the Pacific Ocean. The tactical brilliance that had characterized early Japanese naval operations, the technological innovations that had produced superior fighter aircraft and naval aviation doctrine, and the operational audacity that had enabled simultaneous attacks across thousands of miles of ocean had all proven insufficient against the sustained industrial and military effort of a fully mobilized democratic society determined to achieve complete victory. The lessons of this collapse would resonate through naval thinking for decades, demonstrating that maritime supremacy in the modern era required not merely tactical skill and technological innovation, but the industrial base and human resources necessary to sustain prolonged conflict against determined opposition. The rising sun that had once illuminated Japanese naval power across the Pacific had set forever, leaving American naval forces in undisputed control of the world's largest ocean.